Alexander of Macedon by Harold Lamb. We start into chapter 18, The Elephants and the Last River, which you'll find in part 3. And, yep, this is definitely going to take at least one more video after this one. Why did Alexandros turn aside toward an impassable barrier? 3 times before he had deterred sharply north into the Gordian range, before Gaugamela, to the shore of the Caspian, and lastly at the river of the sands in Scythian territory. Each case he had left well-known routes to strike into the unknown north. No doubt problems of climate and foraging had something to do with this. Strabo says he followed this northern arc through the highlands into India to keep within fertile lands and across the great rivers of India at their headwaters, where the crossing could be made easily, and undoubtedly the Macedonians liked to keep to the north during the summer heat. Mountain climbing did not seem to bother them, yet Alexandros seems to have been impelled by more than logistics of movement. The marches into Scythia and Himalayan India were both extremely dangerous. Apparently, he was bent on exploring. He wanted to examine the inland seas, to find the limits of the steppes, to penetrate this new barrier of mountains. He was eager to trace out the shape of the earth itself, which did not conform at all to the ideas of the Greek academicians. But at each stage, he had to climb higher. Oh, well, if it's Greek, it would have been academicians. But at each stage, he had to climb higher to march further. The very rivers had increased in size. Was there at the last horizon, overlooking the ocean and the place of the sun's rising, evidently of the divine power? Did there exist beings who were more than mortal in their wisdom, having partaken in the fruit of the tree of knowledge, and having drunk of the waters of life? I forget the name of the constellation, but these sorts of myths have actually been connected to constellations. Of course, people invent the constellations. It's not like the stars naturally are whatever constellation, whatever culture decides. Are we talking about 2 twins or a voluptuous woman? Most cultures say a woman. I think one even says a spider, so, It has been said that Alexandros felt driven to fulfill his destiny. Perhaps he journeyed on to discover if destiny existed. Was there, in fact, upon the earth's surface, evidence of the presence of these entities? Did men, in truth, carry out a will superior to their own? Or was the immovable mover, remote and unseen, merely the source of universal energy, of atomic action? And did mankind then progress only by its own efforts towards the enlightenment or towards beastliness? Now, that's actually, actually favoring both of those. Among the Yazidi culture, you have both those streams of sort of a deist sort of thing, where a man becomes a hero, merging the clay beings, merging with the fire beings, either as animals in their purest form or something higher, whatever the focus. Certainly, his constant probing towards the north of Oikumene had revealed in each instance a deterioration of mentality among the marginal inhabitants, among the wild Celts, across the Danube, among the Daha robbers of the Caspian steppes, and the Scythians beyond the river of the sands. Evidently, enlightenment lay to the east rather than to the north. Now, some of these terms are, not quite appropriate for calling people's culture. There was no Apache tribe of Native Americans. There were no former warlocks. Most of those who people might call witches weren't called witches back in the day because they didn't consider themselves Satanists, and that's not the type of way that they looked at their theology, and the Scythians. Beyond the river of the sands, evidently enlightenment lay to the east rather than the north. At the outset of that spring, Alexandros had the help of a bit of luck. More exactly, he turned a chance coincidence into a happy omen that encouraged his men mightily. They found ivy, and with the ivy a legend was connected. At the peasant towns of Nassa, so the Greeks wrote down the name. On the mountain slope, the inhabitants showed them real ivy, which they had found no place else this side of the Dardanelles. Moreover, these people knew the word for it. They knew many Greek words. By degrees, the story came out. The Nassaans thought themselves to be descendants of the heroes that had followed Dionysus in his wandering as far as this. Disabled men, so the tale ran, had founded this ancient colony to perpetuate the Bacchanals in worship of that entity. In proof, they pointed to a nearby summit, Mount Meru. This, they said, was called after the Mount Meru of the homeland, and they offered to show Alexandros proof of their words. So it wasn't killing all Greek colonies, obviously. All this, Aurelian relates, suited to Alexandros exactly, because he wished the legend of the wandering of Dionysus to be believed. So he climbed with the companions, both cavalry on foot, up the slopes of Mount Meru, and found it covered with ivy and laurel groves, with altars shaded by groves wherein wild animals roamed free. Delighted at the sight of the ivy, the Macedonians made garlands. They crowned themselves and danced around singing, invoking the entity by all his names. Alexandros there offered sacrifice to Dionysus and lay down to feast with all his companions. This providential appearance of the sacred vine buoyed up the Macedonians, who reasoned that even if divine power had not led them to Nassa, at least they found evidence that the Greek heroes had been here before them. As a matter of fact, they found rhododendron further on, and vast forest of fir. They found a breed of long-horned oxen so fine and powerful that they sent back a herd to Macedon. Well, there's some sort of root in the myths, no matter how exaggerated. But they had a few feasts after Nassa. As in the heights of Asia Minor and Sogd, the inhabitants proved to be more savage the higher they climbed. Often, these hillmen retired into their sangas, rock fortifications on the summits, just as often as Alexandros insisted on climbing after them, to coax them out, or to pound them out with the mountable engines, which were carried up to the summits in parts. At times, the Highlanders took refuge in cliffside dwellings, and even Macedonian ingenuity was taxed in getting them out again. Alexandros and Ptolemy were both wounded, and the regiments reacted with cruelty. At least once they massacred men who had surrendered, which had not happened before. Well, didn't we say that happened before? But part of the story was kind of not completely known. Higher they climbed towards the stunted wind-bent pipes and rock shoulders of the massif of the Himalayas, and the valleys narrowed, and the broad streams became thundering rapids. Alexandros left the column behind and pushed on with picked mountaineers, and when the air became thin, so that they breathed with difficulty. They found immense ramparts of ice in their way. When they climbed these laboriously, they felt weak, huddling together against the wind blasts that tore at them. Beyond the glaciers, they could see ahead of them, and above the cloud level, still loftier barrier ranges, and a single sentinel of pure white This peak, the surveyors declared, after making calculations of its height, must rise above the air of the earth into the Empyrean. Beyond, the guides told them, are the heights guarded by Indra, who dwells in the upper air amid the storms. In spite of that, Alexandros could see only mountain summits vastly greater than he had examined before. No army could get through here. No benevolent and godlike people seemingly could dwell here. He turned back, heading down towards the Indus, where Hephaestion and Perdiccas were building bridges for the crossing. And just like some of the outfits to protect from the heat in Africa that people say, oh, that must have been alien. It's like, well, no. If people carried around layers of shade, you could say, they really did it in the north, so the Siberia and stuff like this, they didn't really have interest in going up there. He turned south of his own accord. Well, actually, I'm not exactly sure where we're at the moment. He turned south of his own accord to rejoin the main army. Well, Nepal, he wasn't really interested in Nepal, right? He turned south of his own accord to rejoin the main army. But then, a change was taking place in his relation to that army, a change which Alexandros was unaware, although the army was keenly conscious of it. The men understood that their leader had chosen to play the part of a despot, and they suspected, at least, the Macedonians did, that he believed himself to be divine in his power, to overcome all the obstacles lying in his path, and that might mean that Alexandros was insane. Well, the thing is, particularly when it's personified and limited in, in the ways that gendered entities are going to be, these so-called gods and goddesses are indications of stuff about ourselves that we can be. So is the real insanity the projecting of your own problems onto godheads and gods and goddesses of these various things. Perhaps, more than anything else, the unfinished journal of Callisthenes contributed to this belief. The manuscript of the sophist Anabasis, in contrast to the sophist's words, depicted Alexandros as mortal no more, inspired by wisdom of Zeus, led by divine favor upon the path of his destiny. It reeked of flattery. It was meant to destroy man's soul. Alexandros, reading it, must have remembered that Callisthenes had boasted that his Anabasis would bring immortal fame to the Macedonian. After reading the manuscript, Arrian relates that the memory of Callisthenes became odious to Alexandros, but he had more than the sophist's writings with him. While he skirted the Himalayan heights, he had a copy of Aristotle's Rhetoric to Alexandros, which, although impersonal in tone, warned against belief in false evidence. It urged the value of discovery over disputation. It attacked the elder Greek idealism, which motivated even Plato in drawing up the plan of a nebulous republic to embody an ideal good. To this, the cynical Ptolemy objected. By now, he declared, you should know that what is good for one man isn't good for another. Why don't you stick to what is good for you? What would that be?